What happens when two visions of how the world should be powered cannot coexist, and the outcome is decided not by physics but by money, media, and the ability to make the public afraid? In the final decade of the 19th century, two competing systems of electrical power fought for dominance over the infrastructure of modern life, and the contest shaped every city, factory, and household that came after. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
This is often told as a story about two brilliant men with incompatible personalities, but the deeper story is about how technical standards are decided, and why those decisions are never purely technical. Tonight, we turn to the War of Currents as a decisive moment in the formation of modern technological infrastructure. The question is not which inventor was right, but what the struggle between them reveals about how innovation, commerce, and power combine to determine which technologies define the world.
The War of Currents was not primarily a scientific dispute. By the late 1880s, the technical advantages of alternating current for long-distance transmission were well understood. What was at stake was economic control over an infrastructure that was already being built, and the question of who would profit from it.
We are speaking about the conflict between direct current and alternating current as the central struggle in the formation of modern electrical infrastructure.
Edison had built a system. Westinghouse and Tesla proposed a better one. The contest was over whether a better technology could displace an established one when the established one was already embedded in capital contracts and public confidence.
Then let us begin with the two men at the center of this conflict and how their backgrounds shaped their approaches to the problem of electrical power.
Thomas Edison, born in 1847 in Ohio, came to electricity through the telegraph. His formation was entirely American, shaped by the commercial culture of the Midwest, the practical demands of railway communication, and the entrepreneurial opportunities of a rapidly industrializing economy. He thought in systems and markets from the beginning. Nikola Tesla was born in 1856, in what is now Serbia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He studied electrical engineering in Graz and Prague, received a formal scientific education that Edison entirely lacked, and came to electricity through theoretical physics and mathematics. He arrived in New York in 1884 with almost nothing, carrying letters of introduction to Edison.
So the conflict began with a collaboration that failed.
Yes, and here is the first thing we need to correct about the standard account. The popular narrative presents Edison and Tesla as lifelong enemies locked in personal combat. In reality, Tesla worked for Edison for approximately 1 year, left after a dispute over promised compensation, and spent the following years building his own career, largely independent of Edison, before entering the War of Currents through his partnership with Westinghouse. The technical background of the conflict requires brief explanation. Direct current flows in one direction. Edison's system generated direct current at relatively low voltage and distributed it through thick copper cables to nearby customers. The system worked well within a radius of roughly 1 mile from the generating station. Beyond that distance, the power losses became prohibitive.
So Edison's system required a power station in every neighborhood of every city.
Exactly. Alternating current reverses direction many times per second. High voltage alternating current can be transmitted over long distances with relatively small power losses, then step down to safe voltages for domestic use at the point of delivery. A single generating station could serve an entire region. George Westinghouse, a Pittsburgh industrialist who had already revolutionized railway braking systems, recognized the commercial potential of alternating current in the mid-1880s. He licensed Tesla's patents for an alternating current motor and transformer system, and began building a competing electrical infrastructure. By 1888, the Westinghouse Electric Company was a serious commercial challenge to Edison's operation.
So Westinghouse provided the industrial and financial muscle that Tesla's technology needed to compete.
Yes, and Edison responded not by improving his technology but by attempting to destroy the reputation of alternating current. His laboratory began a public campaign arguing that alternating current was uniquely. He organized demonstrations in which dogs, calves, and eventually a horse were electrocuted with alternating current in front of journalists and members of the public.
So he tried to make the public associate alternating current with death.
Precisely, and this strategy extended to his involvement in the development of the electric chair for capital punishment in New York State. Edison opposed capital punishment in principle, but he supplied information on the lethal voltages of alternating current to the committee designing the chair, and he allowed the word Westinghouse to be used as a verb, meaning to be executed. The goal was to brand alternating current as the current that kills.
So the naming of a method of execution was part of a commercial campaign.
Yes. This is the turning point in how the War of Currents should be understood. It was not a debate between scientists. It was a political and commercial struggle conducted through media, public performance, and legal action. Edison's technical conservatism was reinforced by his financial exposure. He had enormous capital invested in direct current infrastructure and in the companies that manufactured direct current equipment. The decisive moment came with the contract for the electrification of the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Westinghouse underbid Edison dramatically, winning the contract to illuminate the fair with alternating current. The fair attracted over 27 million visitors. For many of them it was their first experience of electric light on a large scale, and it arrived in the form of alternating current.
So, the World's Fair became a demonstration platform for the winning technology.
Exactly, and the following year, Westinghouse won the contract to harness the power of Niagara Falls and transmit it to Buffalo, New York, 22 miles away. This was impossible with direct current at any practical cost. The Niagara project, completed in 1895, demonstrated beyond any reasonable dispute that alternating current was the viable technology for large-scale electrical infrastructure.
So Niagara Falls was the experiment that ended the argument.
Yes, Edison's own company, General Electric, which had been formed through the consolidation of his electrical businesses, quietly began producing alternating current equipment in the early 1890s. The engineers at General Electric understood the technical reality regardless of what Edison believed or said publicly. By the end of the decade, direct current had been abandoned as the standard for new installations. Tesla's own trajectory after the war of currents is essential context for understanding the full picture. He had signed over his alternating current patents to Westinghouse in exchange for royalties, and Westinghouse later persuaded him to forgo those royalties to help the company survive a financial crisis. He received a lump sum and gave up what would have been enormous ongoing income.
So the man whose technology won the war ended up with relatively little from the victory.
Yes, Tesla spent the following years pursuing increasingly ambitious and increasingly difficult projects, including wireless transmission of electrical power and a global communications network. He attracted significant investment and then lost it. He ended his life in a New York hotel room in 1943, largely forgotten by the public, his later work unfinished and his financial situation extremely precarious.
So the contrast between Edison's institutional legacy and Tesla's personal fate is one of the starkest in the history of technology.
Precisely, and this contrast is instructive. Edison understood that the value of an invention lies not in the idea but in the system built around it. He was a builder of companies, patents, and infrastructure. Tesla was a generator of ideas, who was far less effective at converting those ideas into durable institutional structures. The war of currents was won by alternating current. The institutional and financial rewards went primarily elsewhere. The role of legal strategy in the war of currents deserves attention. Edison pursued patent litigation aggressively, attempting to use intellectual property law to restrict the spread of alternating current technology. Westinghouse responded by building his own patent portfolio and challenging Edison's claims in court. The legal battles consumed enormous resources on both sides and delayed the deployment of both systems.
So the courts were as important a battlefield as the laboratory or the press.
Yes, and this aspect of the conflict established a template that the technology industry has followed ever since. Patent warfare, strategic licensing, and the use of intellectual property as a competitive weapon, rather than purely as a protection for invention. All of these practices were refined and normalized during the war of currents. The international dimension of the conflict is also worth noting. The struggle over electrical standards in the United States was mirrored in Europe, where competing systems were also being deployed. The eventual global convergence on alternating current as the standard for power transmission was shaped in part by the American outcome, which demonstrated at scale that alternating current was economically viable for large territorial systems. The figure of George Westinghouse is often underemphasized in popular accounts of the war of currents, which tend to focus on the Edison and Tesla personalities. Westinghouse was in many respects the decisive actor. He was a proven industrial entrepreneur with the financial resources, the organizational capacity, and the political connections to deploy a new technology at national scale. Without Westinghouse, Tesla's alternating current patents would have remained laboratory demonstrations.
Though the romantic version of the story erases the man who actually made the technology work at scale.
Yes, and this erasure is itself instructive. The cultural memory of technological revolutions tends to organize itself around individual inventors, rather than around the industrial and financial systems that deploy inventions. Westinghouse, like many of the engineers and managers who built the electrical grid, is largely invisible in the popular story despite being essential to its outcome, and The safety question that Edison raised about alternating current was not entirely without foundation. Alternating current at high voltages is genuinely dangerous, and the early deployment of alternating current systems did result in accidents and fatalities among workers installing the infrastructure. Edison's exploitation of this fact was cynical and commercially motivated, but the underlying technical concern was real and required serious engineering responses to address.
So the propaganda had a kernel of truth that made it effective.
Precisely. Westinghouse and his engineers invested significantly in developing safety standards, insulation technologies, and installation practices that reduce the risks of alternating current to acceptable levels. The safety of the modern electrical grid is partly a product of the pressure that Edison's campaign placed on the alternating current side to take the issue seriously. The financial dimension of the war of currents also shaped its outcome in ways that go beyond the technology itself. Both Edison and Westinghouse faced significant pressure from investors and financiers throughout the conflict. The Morgan banking house, which had backed Edison's electrical ventures heavily, eventually concluded that alternating current was the economically superior option and shifted its support accordingly. Financial institutions, in other words, helped determine the technical standard seal.
So capital made the final decision that the engineers had already made technically.
Yes, and this sequence, the war of currents, is a clear and well-documented example of that pattern, which is part of why it remains useful as a case study for understanding how technological transitions work.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand how this conflict shaped the infrastructure of the modern world, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with The Last Days of Night by Graham Moore.
So this is a book that takes the war of currents as the frame for a broader story about how technological standards are decided.
Moore explores the rivalry between Edison and the alliance of Tesla and Westinghouse, examining how the competition between direct current and alternating current became not only a technical debate, but a struggle over infrastructure, business control, and the future of electrification. The book highlights how legal battles, public campaigns, and industrial strategy shaped the adoption of electrical standards that still define modern power systems today.
Is it accessible to readers without a background in electrical engineering?
Moore writes narrative history with a strong biographical focus. The technical concepts are introduced gradually and clearly. A reader with no prior knowledge of electricity will find the argument entirely followable, and the pacing is engaging throughout.
So it gives the reader the human drama of the conflict alongside the structural analysis of what was actually at stake.
Precisely that. The book is particularly good on the legal dimension of the war, which tends to be underemphasized in popular accounts that focus on the personalities of Edison and Tesla.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The immediate legacy of the war of currents was the global standardization of alternating current as the basis for electrical power systems. The infrastructure built on that standard over the following decades became so deeply embedded in urban development, industrial production, and domestic life that it is essentially invisible today. The alternating current grid is one of the largest and most complex machines ever built by human beings. The broader influence of the conflict on how innovation is organized was equally significant. The war of currents demonstrated that technical superiority alone does not determine which technology wins. What determines the outcome is the combination of technical viability, financial backing, legal strategy, public communication, and the timing of deployment relative to existing infrastructure. This lesson was absorbed by the technology industries that followed.
So the war of currents was also a lesson in how to win a standards battle.
Exactly, and that lesson has been applied repeatedly in the century since. The competition between VHS and Betamax, between competing mobile phone standards, between rival operating systems, between streaming platforms, each of these contests has structural parallels to the war of currents. The victor is rarely the technically superior option. The victor is the option that builds the most effective coalition of manufacturers, distributors, and users. The complications of Edison's legacy in this specific context are considerable. His campaign against alternating current delayed its adoption, increased the cost of the transition, and caused genuine harm through the public demonstrations of animal electrocution. At the same time, his early deployment of direct current infrastructure in New York created the first proof of concept for urban electrification. Without that proof of concept, the Westinghouse system would have had nothing to displace, and no established market to expand into.
So Edison built the first version of something that was then replaced by a better version, and both steps were necessary.
Yes, this is a pattern that recurs throughout the history of infrastructure technology. The first mover builds the market and establishes the social expectation that the technology will work. The second mover improves the technology and captures the market the first mover created. Edison's direct current system was both the origin and the obstacle of modern electrical infrastructure. Tesla's legacy was rehabilitated significantly in the 20th century, particularly after the unit of magnetic flux density was named the Tesla in his honor in 1960. The cultural revival of interest in Tesla in recent decades, in which he has been recast as a romantic visionary suppressed by corporate interests, is itself instructive. It reflects a persistent cultural desire for the figure of the pure inventor uncorrupted by commerce, a figure that Tesla approximates more closely than Edison in popular memory, though the reality of both men was considerably more complex.
So what we remember about Edison and Tesla tells us as much about our own anxieties about technology and commerce as it does about the men themselves.
Precisely, and the modern relevance of the war of currents lies precisely there. We are living in a period of competing infrastructure standards in energy, in digital communication, in artificial intelligence. The questions being decided now about who controls the infrastructure, who sets the standards, and whether the technically superior option or the commercially superior one prevails, are the same questions that Edison and Westinghouse fought over in the 1880s. The transition to renewable energy infrastructure today has structural parallels to the war of currents that are difficult to ignore. Established fossil fuel infrastructure represents embedded capital and political interest, exactly as Edison's direct current network did. New renewable technologies offer technical and economic advantages at scale, exactly as alternating current did. The outcome will be determined not only by physics and economics but by legal frameworks, public communication, and the politics of industrial transition.
So the war of currents is not a historical episode, it is a recurring structure.
Exactly, and that is why understanding it carefully matters. Not because Edison and Tesla were exceptional individuals, though they were, but because the forces that shaped their conflict, capital, infrastructure, public perception, legal strategy, and the inertia of established systems, are the forces that shape every major technological transition.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the conflict between two visions of how the world should be powered, and what that conflict still tells us about how technological change actually works.
The war of currents reminds us that the infrastructure we inherit was not inevitable. It was chosen, fought over, and built by people with interests. And understanding those interests is the beginning of understanding the world we live in.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.